Welcome to the January 30th meeting of the Zoning Subcommittee. This meeting is being recorded for later broadcast by Amherst Media. Are there any announcements? Minutes of the previous meeting. Thanks, Bruce. Those are
you're welcome.
very complete. And it was a difficult meeting, I'm sure, but it looks like it's an excellent summary. I have actually one comment, though. I'm sorry about that. On page 4 at the very top, my suggestion is to separate, as you say, separate form-based standards from the original proposal of specific village centers and apply them to village centers in general, and then do overlays for these specific village centers. That was my suggestion.
Will you amend that, Jonathan? Or?
Sure.
Any other comments on the minutes or a motion? Okay. All in favor of the motion? Okay, that's a 4-0 vote. So this session, again, a working session so that we can figure out how we're going to proceed this spring. Specifically, which articles or which possible amendments we think are close enough to be ready for the spring, and or that we particularly want to work on, whether for the spring or later. In other words, how are we going to spend our time? How do we want to propose to the planning board to direct us to spend our time? So thank you, Mr. Tucker, and whoever else was responsible. The proposed amendments are
daunting,
lengthy, but it's very helpful to see them in this form. It makes makes our decision, I think, both harder and easier. Harder in the sense that we know how much work there is, and easier in the sense that we can more easily decide which is closer and which is not.
You want to have a quick review of each of them, or do you want to sort of review them as written here, and then ask questions, and then proceed to suggestions about priority, or how do you want to approach this?
Does any member of the committee have a preference? I think I'd like to just go through them one by one as quickly as possible. Not really commenting on the merits or the form necessarily, but with an eye towards can we do this or should we do this? So let's see. So actually, before we go on, I guess the first point is to note that we had asked that they be grouped in several common clusters, I guess, so that we have a sense of what might go together and what might be different. The first one, the one that we suggested as our priority, was mixed-use center amendments. I'll note that the planning board was not overwhelmingly in favor of that, but they also didn't shoot it down as yet. So let's look at mixed-use center amendments and see what's there. The first one is sustainable design and development standards. Is this lifted word for word out of the original?
It is lifted mostly word for word. There have been some other minor revisions since this was developed as part of the form-based design regulations. I would note that it's really two sections. There's the sustainable alternative energy standards section, and then there's the low impact development, which is as much about drainage and as anything else. And those are divisible. I mean, we could make this into two amendments if that made more sense. I would also note that yesterday evening there was the TMCC held a forum on greening Amherst, talking about the master plan and so forth, so that there appears to be some support for this kind of change.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know whether that translates into priority for the planning board, but you should be aware of it.
Comments? Bruce, go ahead.
I feel a little concerned about this in the sense of the extra cost involved to developers when we have very little development to begin with. And to me, I think these are all laudable, but it just makes me a little worried that if we finally would get village centers underway and possible developers would see this, I hope it wouldn't frighten them away. Because I know there's still comments about the procedures in Amherst taking a long time and a lot of steps to go through and so forth, and this, to me, makes me just a little nervous.
Okay. Connie?
Similarly to Mr. Carson, I am concerned about adding another layer of permitting burden and expense in the first section, but in terms of low-impact development standards, the lid for drainage and the environmental impacts of a more sensitive drainage system. I think Amherst has been kind of a few years coming late to the table to LID, and I would support the LID amendments. I don't think that they're onerous, and maybe separate it out. Also, I didn't spend a lot of time on the sustainable design development systems, but some of it is kind of squishy, and so I think enforcing it or applying it may be difficult. But I am concerned about damping down some redevelopment and some development activity that I think we'd actually like to encourage. If I could just add one more I did have a thought when I was looking at the changes we'll be looking at later in the commercial district, that maybe we wanted to link some of the increases in lot coverage, height, and whatever to meeting some of the sustainable development criteria. So it could be a little bit of a trade. You get to do more, but then you meet a higher standard for sustainability, which could be even as simple as saying you meet the LEED silver or gold standard or comparable measure or better, and then you get a little bit more intensity of development on a lot. So.
Any other comment? Go ahead.
Just a quick comment that since LEED is determined after the building's built, that's kind of a hard measure. You know, in other words, you don't know until after it's built whether or not it meets. But
Then they have to tear it down.
they have to tear it down, right? But I have concerns also, and maybe for slightly different reasons. One is that I think some of this is better placed and actually is in the building codes. For example, the stretch code includes a lot of energy conservation. I'm not sure we have the. I guess one thing I look for is things that we even have the wherewithal to measure, and so that would be one that we actually don't. The building solar orientation. See, this without form, it becomes kind of a difficult. So I can see the building solar orientation actually becoming a very anti-development tool. So in fact, it could preclude any kind of infill or vacant lot development if the abutting neighbors are claiming a right to solar access, which is what this is suggesting. So let's take a scenario in Amherst where a middle of the block building's torn down. All of a sudden, there's solar access where there didn't used to be solar access. And so then this would actually prevent that because, anyway, I have concerns about this without the actual form behind it, because sometimes it's actually more sustainable not to, kind of favor other conditions in favor of solar. And then lastly, the low impact development. Similarly, other than that, I love it, but No, I
Something
actually
you
also
need.
have somewhat concerns about that, because some of these encourage larger sites. So sometimes you need larger sites and actually less development on sites to, to accommodate some of the things that are being discussed here, where there's lots of cases where it's more sensible to basically use centralized stormwater, in other words. Sometimes in the interest of actually living compactly, you don't want to do what's referred to as low-impact development.
I also wondered if these things should be worded in terms of encouraging people to do these things rather than saying shall be or shall integrate, and, always using the word shall and making it a definitive requirement. Because I think that there are certain cases where you wouldn't want to do certain of these things because you wanted to do something else that would be beneficial, and if you say shall, that indicates that you have to do it.
Well, under 4.6 alternative energy facilities, it's pretty squishy because it says to the extent feasible. So if we could maybe equivocate and say to the extent feasible or practicable or,
For the other things.
yeah, I mean, it's not for the ones low impact development.
So before we continue with this discussion, it sounds like there's not a lot of enthusiasm for it, so maybe we just cut it off right now. I mean, I would note that we already implicitly endorsed these when we brought the village center proposal forward, but now we're backchecking. I understand there's a reason why that we did. In any case, it sounds like it'll take longer than a night to hammer this out. So is it worth spending the time on? So I guess I would say if the planning board agrees to let us work or directs us to work on center zoning, I anticipate spending a lot of time on that and not bogging down in this kind of detail. On the other hand, if they say don't do that, wait until whenever, then we can take more time to do this. So I would say it sounds like we shouldn't recommend this one tonight.
Well, the thing about the form-based code is that I thought the form dominated, and then this was almost secondary or supporting the form. But without the form, then
Right.
there's not a, kind of a big vision as to what the.
If I may, I didn't include, it was on your, excuse me, on your larger list, but I didn't include in this draft language for the form-based design regulations because in the form in which they currently stand, they were written as integrated into specific districts that combined both form-based regulations and use regulations, and we had talked about the possibility of pulling those apart and having standard form-based regulations at some level applying to a certain number of mixed-use zoning districts regardless, just period, that they wouldn't require additional anything, they would just apply in those districts. And then possibly overlays that were specific to those districts that had particular character that then modified the rest of the form-based regulations. So it's out there, it's an opportunity, the opportunity to work on it is there. We just haven't pulled that apart and put it in a form yet that would reflect what you've talked about. And we've started, but we're not there yet.
Mr. Chair, I had gone through and kind of ranked these for myself, and just for the record, having separated them out, I gave the sustainable alternative energy a 3, which was my lowest priority category, and I gave the lid requirements a 1. So, if any other members want to speak in pursuit of refining the low impact development standards, that's where I fell out on it.
Well, we already have an objection or a indication that low impact development also is an extended discussion possibly. So, I'm asking whether it's is it that important that we should have that discussion at the expense of other things that we might think are more important, or should we say that that actually really is a high priority and we should figure out how to do it.
It seems to me that, I won't hazard about how complex it would be, but the objection that LID standards really tend to expand the amount of area disturbed in order to have a lower impact overall on the surrounding areas and the environmental systems is real. Therefore, you could say we will apply this to greenfields developments in Office Park or Professional Research Park. We could apply it to greenfields development in any of the zoning districts where there's a lot that has not previously been developed, but that we would have a different standard for the use of these techniques for the redevelopment or infill.
I would be okay in a, I'm sorry, I'd be okay in a case where there's kind of a mandated requirement for open space, kind of like what you're describing. So in other words, so this would be a way of using that open space to not just, you know, to actually help the cause rather than just serving as a buffer.
How would you rank this priority system?
As amended, I actually think it's high.
Okay. Any objection to
No,
asking
I
more
guess
things?
not. No, I guess I'd like to wait, maybe in reserve judgment, depending on what else we come up with.
Okay. All right, let's go to agricultural processing.
You'll recall this was a fairly, actually fairly minor change that you added as a way of supporting agricultural activity. You put it in what's been referred to as our light manufacturing use category, which actually includes quite a number of things. It would allow various kinds of agricultural processing in the BBC, LI, and PRP districts and elsewhere by special permit. Particularly intensive use or particularly potentially disturbing use of the processing of animal products would be limited to the light industrial district and only under a special permit. We do have properties under various ownerships in the light industrial district west of 116, sort of in the middle of farm areas, so that's an appropriate supportive use should that be proposed. That's sort of it.
Okay. Any comments? Anyone want to go forward with this one?
I just have one question. Would it be helpful, do you think, to give us examples what agricultural processing is, such as including blank, 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 just to have some idea of when people look at this initially, what they would anticipate?
Yeah, that seems reasonable.
I had a question about whether there should be a reference to agricultural processing in the beginning of this section where you're describing.
There was. I was just noticing that. I've made a note to myself that it somehow failed to make it into this version, but there was a citation of that.
So this seems like an easy one to me. I don't see a lot of dispute about it. It's something that people have asked for. So, you know, again, it's not at the end of the world if it doesn't pass, but we might as well bring it forward if we have the time. So that's the way I see it. Okay. Com district amendments. Thanks for working on this. This is
I have a number of those. The first is the dimensions, and it's BL and COM district dimensions. In Table 3, those two districts are regulated simultaneously. They're regulated the same. So it's not just the commercial district that would be affected. What is proposed is to make it very close to, but not exactly the same as, the Village Center Business District. And I think that's partly the intent here. We're trying to make this slightly denser in some ways, and not in others. I did do a rather unusual thing here in that I have a half floor
Yes, I saw
under
that.
maximum floors. I noticed elsewhere in the bylaw in residential districts, there are maximum floors of 2.5 floors in a couple of residential districts. Yeah, the RLD and the RO. So, and really what that's intended to do is accommodate the increased height. But that can change. Let's see. The things that are the same, the basic minimum lot area is the same as the BVC. And you can see on the left is where the existing standard is. The additional lot area per family, although we're proposing a superscript A, and there should be a B next to that as well, where essentially the additional lot area in some area would not apply, except for very selected kinds of residential uses. This is the central column proposed. Additional lot area per family, it's 2,500, and then it says superscript A. Now it should have a superscript B on it. Max minimum lot frontage, same thing, 100, same as the BVC. Front setback down to 10, which allows you to get closer to the road and create a streetscape rather than being set back as currently is the case. Side and rear yards don't really change. They're 25 feet everywhere. Those were kept the same. Maximum building coverage, the percentage remains the same, but added a superscript A to allow for the possibility it could be modified under a special permit. Maximum lot coverage, not changed. It's the same. It's already denser than BVC. And there are different circumstances under which it is one or the other. Again, the maximum floors, and again, if you think 3.5 is silly, I actually thought it was something that might be more digestible than 4. Going to 4, which is what the limit is in the downtown general business district, seemed to me would generate a reaction that people would have trouble with that. And then the maximum height goes up 5 feet from 35 to 40.
Is that maximum floors above ground level? So how would you get in a half floor, and what use would a half floor be?
The floors are defined in the dimensional section, Article 6. And let's see. Height is one thing. Let's see. Floor. It's actually not defined. It doesn't have its own section. Maximum height is measured from the highest point of any roof, that is the portion of the building that is enclosed and used by human beings. Doesn't count chimneys and spires and so forth, based on the average finished grade on the street side of the structure. So I imagine that in the absence of a specific reference elsewhere in the bylaw, that would be the same rule that would be applied to where do you measure floors from.
Okay. So I think that would be useful then. This is exactly what I was looking for. I would like to, I think this is an important change, and I would like to continue working on this regardless of how long it takes. Any comments?
I think it's a high priority as well, but I think Mr. Tucker partly answered the question I was going to ask when he said, well, this is sort of a digestible number, and I think some of these are just so small, I might want to push, people could push back on what some of these numbers were, because it's sort of like zoning with Rolaids. And I'll tell you the ones I was looking at. I think of BL Commercial as a slightly more intensive use district than BVC, so or just at least think about changing the basic lot area to 10,000, the additional lot area per unit or family. I'm happy to see it go to 2,500, but maybe even considering 1,500. The other one, the lot coverage in BVC at 65, so I was thinking maybe 65/75. And then the maximum floor 3.5, I think it's either 3 or it's 4. To me, that's just like silly, unless it's I don't think it's based, I think it's less defendable if it's to make it more digestible, but it doesn't make sense. And then maximum height, I might say instead of 40, to go to 45, so add 10 feet. But I'm just testing, my inclination is to go further, but maybe it's not worth it.
Well, that's what I would imagine, that we would spend some time figuring out what is the right numbers, but
Right.
this is the start.
Right, we're just deciding.
Yep. Steve?
Yeah, so one of the parts that I'm not sure, actually help me out, have we addressed the part about the mixed use and commercial?
No, this is just dimensions.
But that's,
We're getting there.
Okay, we're getting, yeah. But what she said, or else, I would tend to get rid of as many footnotes as possible, but I'm in favor of this or more intense, and the John Malkovich floor, I'd get rid of that.
The half floor?
Yeah.
I don't
Because we're.
know that reference, I'm not good on
Being
popular,
John Malkovich.
but I don't get it.
Have you seen the movie Being John Malkovich?
No.
13th and a half floor.
I wasn't sure what Connie said about maximum lot coverage. It seemed like you were making it less than
Oh,
maximum.
Yes. Right now, it's 70 or 85,
right, percentage.
depending.
Oh, I guess I was trying to match BVC, but just leave that one alone then. Right.
The reason I was concerned about that
Logical.
is because you need the area, the lot coverage for parking.
Never mind, it was illogical, my thinking was illogical.
Yeah.
Anyway, as I think our chair pointed, we're just reviewing to work on, so we don't really need to
Right, we did.
dive in. It was too tempting. though.
Just so you know that this is underway.
What?
It's underway if you're interested.
Bruce, do you want to make any comment?
No, I would support continuing with this,
Okay.
although my only reservation would be if we had to choose between this and the village centers, I think I might want to go ahead with Atkins rather than this, if it seemed like too much at one time.
Okay, thanks. Height modification,
Yeah, maximum height modification. This expands on an existing footnote, which applies to, as if you go look back at the previous, actually, does it even show there? No, it's a superscript on the entire, not column, what's the other way? So,
Row.
Yeah, the row. And what it would do is allow, as superscript A does, it would allow the maximum height to be modified under a special permit, rather than saying, this is it, you're done, no matter what. Here it is. And it provides reasons, building function, utility, or design, including but not limited to ensuring the construction of the full number of maximum floors is practicable on a given site. It's a way of saying, we want you to be able to do the maximum number of floors here. But it's a special permit, so if the special permit granting authority thinks it doesn't make any sense, then they can say no. The modification has to consider the context of the patterns of height established by existing buildings in the surrounding area. No modification should go up more than 5 feet beyond the existing maximum. We might want to play with that number. It's just in there.
so I see this is going right along with the previous article. I think they're the same idea, and they should be worked on together. So I would say whatever we do with one, we should also do with the other. Any objection to that?
It's labeled maximum building coverage, the next one, but it's really green roofs. And this is a amendment we worked on some time ago. And what it did was to establish parameters for determining what green roofs were. The second section is, B is definitions. But it then allows you to increase the maximum building coverage by a certain amount based on the amount of green roof you have. So, and much of this, the model and some of the numbers was taken from the regulations in Portland, Oregon, which was the best example we could find at the time. This is actually old. This was from 2 years ago. We started working on this, 2011. So I just updated it, reformatted it, stuck a new date on the top.
Okay.
I'm sorry,
ahead.
is this similar to one that was that came before the planning board 2 years?
3 years ago, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. It is that one,
It never,
in new clothing.
get past planning board, right?
Do not, right, the planning board decided not to recommend it.
Does anyone remember why?
Well, for some reason that I'm a little concerned about right now, I think there was, it was not clear that it accomplished the goal that it was trying to accomplish. That is, was it really promoting green roofs, or was it promoting lot coverage? It's not. It wasn't really clear what it was really promoting.
The original, if I may, the original impetus for this, aside from, hey, this would be a good idea, was a specific request from a local architect who was working at the time, I believe, on the Common School. And they were trying to find ways to, because it was a small, non-conforming site, to increase the building area without getting into a special permit to increase a non-conformity. And what the architect proposed was, well, if we put a green roof in, first they just asked, would that count as building? And we said, yeah. And then the next is can we modify the bylaw so that it in some way recognizes green roofs as not the same kind of coverage as a flat roof with a tar and stone covering on it, or any other form of roof that's impermeable.
Sorry, after you.
Oh, I'm just thinking, whoops, it's my pen. Instead of having this where it is, maybe under our kind of, maybe we bring things together under this sort of sustainable development category. And again, and maybe not for spring, but we link up some bonuses or concessions around meeting certain criteria. And I'm very much in favor of incentives for green roofs, how we do it and how that fits in. And so maybe you get more coverage if you do a green roof or a photovoltaic. I mean, I don't think we have the whole menu yet, but I would take this and maybe put it aside as some of the things we want to work on for sustainable development.
If I may, that's a sort of a reduced version of the model we used for development modification, because at the time we were talking about pace of development and so forth. And using same kinds of incentives and disincentives model.
Right. But this is around the intensity of use, and phased growth doesn't have a lot of teeth when there's not much development happening.
It's also illegal, so.
But
So dimensions exist for multiple reasons, health, safety, and welfare, but then also aesthetic. So I think one of the problems I had with this is that it's dealing with one issue. It's dealing with, so certainly the lot coverage issue, assumes that the rest of the lot is where stormwater can be addressed and.
parking.
But then the other reason is aesthetic. In other words, if certain patterns are set up where it really controls density. And so I think the problem I had with this one is that I was looking at one thing, basically stormwater management, and not at the kind of the aesthetic, the neighborhood patterns. So the prospect of there being much larger houses in RG, because the houses happen to have green roofs, didn't make that much sense.
Right. I think that was.
So essentially it needed that larger frame, that if it made sense from a design standpoint in the context, then these things would apply, rather than the other way around.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
One problem I would have with green roofs too is the issue of maintenance. I think that many of the people who might do this in order to gain building coverage larger lot coverage might not be inclined to maintain it, and we don't really have a system in place for going up on people's roofs and checking them. So I think that would have to be thought about in order to enter into this kind of thing.
I think that's a good point, but I think it could be handled because the green roof movement is really thriving out there, and I bet we could find some examples of some language, because, you know, we have landscape plans and how well people water or maintain. So I think it's a valid concern, but I wouldn't let it stand in the way of wanting to start seeing Amherst get some green roofs.
So I would agree that we should group this under the sustainable design thing and not prioritize it for the spring. But it is something that people have asked for and are sort of looking for, but it's more complicated than a one-night discussion.
That's our criteria now.
So before we go into student housing, I thought I saw something about the
I can't find it actually. about
units, and I
Mixed use.
I feel like it was on the attachments, but I don't see it in the pages. Is it?
Yes, you're right. I didn't include it, but we do have it. And basically, the principal change that it would make is to increase the number of potential units by right on upper floors from 6 to a larger number. And 12 was the initial number for no particular reason. It's a multiple of 6.
Okay, so where was that?
See, we're-
We don't have paper for it. That's
I think this is a really important one.
What is it?
This is about right now in the commercial district, if you want to do a mixed-use building that has both businesses and residential uses in it, it's by right up to a certain threshold. And one of the thresholds is no more than 6 units, residential units. And part of the impact of that is that you can end up with a building that has only a few residential units in it, and they're really big units with lots of bedrooms, because you just don't have the lot area to do more. In the commercial district, you have to have the additional lot area for that to work. So part of the thought here was to relieve it of the burden of, as we did before under the dimensional thing, relieve it of the burden of the additional lot area per unit, and increase the number that would be of units that would be by right in a mixed-use building under site plan review before you tripped it over into special permit.
And you were proposing, we don't have it, the draft.
You don't have it in front of you, but it's
6 to 12, doubling?
going up to, up
And
to
what
12.
was your, and based on, what was your thinking?
I didn't sit down with a plan on some typical properties and go, you know, here's how big a building you could get on this based on the building or lot coverage, and you know how many, and it's 3 stories. You got two floors of residential uses, and you know what's the normal size. I didn't do that. We can back into that.
it's just a number that
It is.
It's a placeholder number.
Well, yeah, if it's a placeholder, we can derive a number.
And we have some in town we can look at.
Yes, we do.
So that's one that I think is worth working on. So
And also, I think to the limit that they have to all be on the upper floor is worth taking a look, because they all have to be above the ground floor, right?
Yeah, I think one of the, my dim recollection of my own amendments as I was doing this included the possibility for 1 unit on the ground floor, where you would have when you had a circumstance where you had a proprietor and their operation right next to each other. The thing that they wanted to avoid in the earlier version that is in the bylaw now is not having the ground floor, which should be retail, commercial, office use in a mixed-use center, being taken up with storage units or something for upper story residential units. The intent was that there be a genuine balance of some kind between the uses in the building, and that the first floor in particular be retail and office and so forth. That's easy to say. It doesn't allow them any response to the market, but that was the intent.
I remember working on a project in Florence. It was, it was a rehab of an existing mixed use, and there was an issue. The proponent wanted to have a handicap accessible unit on the ground floor, and so we might want to consider the 10% exception. I mean, in an elevated building, or it may be a non-issue, but in some of the smaller developments that don't require elevators, or some kind of a rehab or reuse, it might be a good idea to allow a ground floor unit, not just for caretaker, but for handicapped accessibility.
Okay, so in any case, it's something more. Go ahead, Chris.
This whole discussion is reminding me that there's often a question of why landowners want to build larger units with more bedrooms, and sometimes they don't. And you will have an opportunity tonight to hear a presentation about the presidential apartments, which actually is suggesting making smaller units. I think there are a lot of one-bedroom units and some two-bedroom units, but if I'm not mistaken, very 3 or no 3 and 4 bedroom units. So that indicates to me that there's a market for these smaller units, and allowing them to occur may, sort of circumvent some of the problems that we have with the larger units. So that's something that you might want to think about when you're considering zoning amendments, as well as when you're looking at this presidential presentation this evening. You look like you don't.
Well, I think that sword cuts two ways, because then you may be not including housing for families. So, and there's sometimes reasons people don't want to provide family housing. So I don't want to slowly get into this social engineering around unit size and bedroom mix. So there's more than one way.
May I just have a follow-up on that? I think one of the things is that, when we think about numbers of units, we get scared about the numbers of people that are going to go along with numbers of units. But the fact is, you can have a larger number of units that are smaller and still, not have enormous numbers of people.
Right.
So that's something that is worthy of consideration.
Mm-hmm. Right, so when we're talking about 6 units in a mixed-use building, we could be talking about 6 4-bedroom units, or we could talk about 6 1-bedroom units. I mean, that's a big difference. So if we want to be able to provide a chance for a lot of people different family groups or household groups to live in that place like that, then more units is desirable.
Right. What we did have in the form-based use regulations or design regulations, particularly in North Amherst, but elsewhere too, an emphasis on bedroom mix, that there be a relatively even mix of bedroom sizes within a building, so it wasn't all one way or another way, and the building itself would not get trapped into a situation with the market, because the market changes over time. I don't think you want to get into dictating it only one way or only another way or whatever. But the thing to remember about the by right and the bedroom count, or rather the unit count that we're dealing with, is that it's up to. So it could be anywhere from 2 to 12. So there's a very wide range of possibility in there. Yep.
Okay, so put this one on the list. Okay. Student housing and boarding uses.
This was an initial and partial response to the idea that was floated at the forum, or at an earlier meeting, that part of the way to meet off-campus student housing needs was to have specifically allow student housing of different kinds and sizes, usually smaller sizes. One way to deal with that is to, in the current category of fraternity or sorority building and other uses associated with the educational institution, there's a category of social dormitory, which does not automatically presume that it is a residential facility owned by, controlled by one of the institutions. And so part of the intent here to just explore this is to break that out as a separate category and regulate it differently and allow it more broadly, principally by special permit, but allow it more broadly. Define it, talk about what's possible in specific districts outside of the fraternity residence district. Keep it again, no more than, I think it was 24 student beds were mentioned, and the same kinds of provisions we would have for any other similar use. Then under lodging or boarding house, not so much as a direct response, but partly looking at that again, and again, this is divisible if we wanted to do this, but it does also meet this need. Right now, we did not change the use category last time. We just addressed the definition. It did not occur to me that it made a whole lot of sense for lodging or boarding house to be by special permit in the limited business or the village center business district. It should be a by right use. So that's one change. It's 6 to 10 people, as I recall, or rooms. So that's a manageable size. So going to site plan review there made sense. Also, there's some of the usual changing specific references to specific boards to special permit granting authority or permit granting board, references to other regulations, and then I noted that under lodging or boarding house, there was no requirement for a management plan stated in the standards and conditions, and that would seem to be a minimum requirement. It is required under the rules and regulations of the planning board. If someone applied for this, they'd still have to do it, but it's better to have it clear in this area. And then a reference to the newly minted definition made some sense. So again, this is divisible. It responds in part to this, but it doesn't respond in whole.
Comments? Anyone want to, don't even want to look at the work on this? Or?
I'll take a shot. I think it's sort of commendable, very creative. A couple, I know it was discussed by one person who attended the forum. Right now, I just don't want to go there with this because there's other things that I think we want to build support for, and I think this might be a diversion, and I don't know that there's a pressing need. I'm also nervous about calling it student housing and boarding uses. I'd rather have it be boarding uses and under that a category that has student residential, because I just think that's almost like waving the red flag to the bull. So, because it's not about, there's so much more we could say about student housing and creating a new category called student housing, and it's really about the social dormitories. I know a lot of students do live in co-ops in other cities and communities, so I think there's some merit in this, but for me, I would like to take a pass on it for now.
I think that it'll address the student housing issue in a very small way. So in other words, I think that it's important, but I think that there's kind of bigger ticket items that can, address basically the housing concerns in a bigger way. So I think we should definitely have it on the burner, but probably the back burner.
Bruce?
I would agree. I really would rather have us take the time to go back to our subject we had talked about of, is there a possibility of more private student housing, for instance, in the existing apartment complexes or redeveloping sites in the town? I think, to me, that would be more important than proceeding with this.
See, actually, I think this actually addresses that directly. It's a way of providing private student housing. This is an option. You can do a social dormitory type of thing, rather than have 24 units. You can provide 24 beds, and it might be something that is.
That reminds me. One of the reasons, in addition to the comment that was received at the forum, that this came up was discussions with a local developer who was looking at the possibility of redeveloping an existing fraternity or sorority site for denser student housing, but had the challenges of what the bylaw limit and the map limited things to, so that you had a site that was currently being put to this use where you had numerous people, but you couldn't reuse it if that if the fraternity or the sorority went out of business, you couldn't reuse it for that purpose. And so in effect, you were losing that capacity. So that was one of the impeti behind this. But I don't disagree about relative priority among all the things that are out there.
I agree with what you were saying, and I thought of that too, but the reason why I wasn't keen on pursuing this is it's a different type of housing, and I think it might be more threatening this way because people don't understand it perhaps, or think it's just going to be unmanageable buildings, whereas at least proceeding with the type of apartments we have right now, I think people can at least understand what that looks like and how that's managed. And there are just little things in here, such as the 2 beds available for resident adult supervisors. That doesn't mean they're actually going to live there.
Well, that would be something that we could discuss, but I take your point that it does make sense what you're saying. So people don't want to proceed with this.
So I think, I mean, you bring up a good point that maybe this could be a tool to actually encourage private student housing. But here's the thing, that I'm not sure that students who, and maybe the housing study will show this, but I'm not sure that students who live off campus are looking for the dormitory life.
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, I think that living off campus is kind of not the dormitory life. In other words, but I'm just speaking, I'm just guessing. So I think that there's other kinds of ways of providing private student housing that don't necessarily involve this.
Mm-hmm.
But I do wonder, actually, because we do have presidential apartments coming down the pike, whether, if this were available to them, that they would consider one of those blocks being something like this. I mean, I really have no idea.
I could see a variant of this appealing to foreign graduate students, because I think they would be willing to make the accommodations to have something more affordable and with cooking privileges or shared, whatever it was. So there may be a need, and I'm wondering if the housing market study will give us any more information about a market for this kind of housing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's pass on this one for the time being and maybe come back to it. Family and household definition.
This is the functional family definition that you had looked at before. It is unchanged from before.
Does anyone want to work on this, or no enthusiasm for this one? Okay.
Has merit, but not right now.
Okay. Non-conforming buildings. Thank you for doing this, because now it makes a lot more sense what you were talking about before. I didn't really understand. Several times that was explained. Now I get it.
Okay, this one is a little complicated, and let me try and walk through it, and I will lean on Chris to go, no, that's not really what we talked about. What we talked about was this. We have run into we have 2 kinds of challenges in terms of non-conforming buildings. The first is a long-standing interpretive practice. For years, dimensionally non-conforming buildings in residential districts received a lot of attention from building commissioners, several of them, in my experience, as something that you always paid close attention to, and partly because neighbors were paying very close attention to it. And if somebody wanted to convert an existing outbuilding to a residence, or they wanted to move a wall or something, if the building started out non-conforming, there was past practice that the entire use was considered non-conforming. It went to the Zoning Board of Appeals. It was a 2 or 3 month process, and that's the way it went. At the same time, in our village centers and in our downtown, which were built long before anybody contemplated zoning or created the zoning regulations that we have, almost every single building is non-conforming. And it had been the practice of building commissioners to not require a special permit review of the nonconformity if somebody was doing something minor with the exterior of the property or so forth. That's inconsistent. And what we would like to do is to have a system or language which deals with this so that we don't create a 2-tiered system of dealing with things based solely on the interpretation by the zoning enforcement officer, which is an administrative action. We want the bylaw itself to address that. So that's one piece. Another piece is that we have encountered a number of circumstances where we have former residential buildings that were built reasonably close to property lines or and are now in mixed-use center zoning, and people want to try and use them. And we're splitting the difference between those two categories that I mentioned before, where previously it would have been looked at very closely. Now it's in a district where they didn't look at that so closely, and so that's part of what's spurring the change. And the way the language reads now is that there's an emphasis on changes to the structure. And it's not clear whether, the way the language is written now, whether or not you have to have an exterior change that in fact alters the structural members of the building in order to invoke the regulations, or whether, because the use is going to be, or has in the past been presumed to be non-conforming, any change at all, even inside the building that you don't see, invokes the process. So what we're trying to do is go through all of this and relieve where it makes no sense, where it doesn't matter. So nothing that anybody is going to see, nothing that is going to be functional is going to have an impact. We're trying to relieve the property, and in many cases the building commissioner, of this decision. Some years ago, if you look at the language in front of you, we added the section that starts 9.200 for residential properties. We enabled the building commissioner on their own recognizance, without a ZBA review, to say, if the following conditions are true, 3 different sets of conditions, then the building commissioner alone can allow this to proceed. What we would like to do is attach that same license, if you will, to commercial buildings in mixed-use centers. So starting at the top, we've added a sentence at the end of the first paragraph here that it deals with the question of whether a change needs to be exterior, or whether or not it needs to be structural. And in this case, we are saying, yes, it needs to be a change to the exterior, and it needs to be structural in the sense of affecting load-bearing elements of the building or structure in order to invoke this non-conforming review. So we're taking out of the path interior changes that nobody sees, even if they're structural changes. If you don't see them, then we're not invoking this. Sometimes the dimensional nonconformity, for instance, is a setback from the side yard, and if that wall is not getting any closer to the side yard, if the wall isn't moving, getting longer parallel to the side yard and still intruding, then the nonconformity is not being affected, and the intent is to relieve the property of that review. Down below, 9.201, is the provision where we are trying to allow the building commissioner to make these same 3 changes here. If the property meets in a mixed-use center, as those listed, meets any of these conditions, then the building commissioner alone can allow something to go forward. Turning the page over, this is a version of that, but it addresses circumstances that the others don't, where a new or expanded existing non-conforming use is proposed in an existing lawful dimensionally non-conforming building, and no exterior alteration, reconstruction, extension, or structural change will occur, the permit requirements of section 3.3, which means the use chart, will still apply, but no additional special permit to deal with nonconformity will be required. And then finally, the B section is simply fixing up, as we do every time we run into it, the language in section 9.22 that says Board of Appeals rather than Special Permit Granting Authority, and so forth. Does that all make sense? Chris, did I make that make sense? Or
Well,
there more?
I just wanted to give an example, and I won't get too specific about it, but there is a building in town that is very close to a property line, and the use is conforming in the district, but the building is non-conforming. And because of
Dimensionally.
that,
Yes.
dimensionally nonconforming, the building commissioner had the new owners come to the zoning board of appeals to examine the use. And then, if there had been requirements for site changes as the result of the zoning board's examination of the use, the project would have then gone to the planning board to look at the changes to the site. So these applicants would have had to go to the zoning board of appeals and the planning board to do what they wanted to do on the site. So part of this is, in order to alleviate that possibility, it is to allow the planning board. In the past, the whole thing would have gone to the zoning board of appeals because the building was non-conforming. So whatever happened to the site would have been dealt with by the zoning board of appeals and the building and the use. In this case, we are trying to allow the permit granting authority, whoever that is, under the table, the use chart, to grant the special permit for whatever changes might need to happen to the building as a result of the building non-conforming. So in the case that I'm thinking of, the whole thing would have gone to the planning board, and the planning board would have looked at the use and determined whether there were site changes that needed to be made. And if there had been any changes that needed to be made to the building, the planning board could have granted a special permit to alter the building. We're just trying to make applicants not have to go to two boards at the same time to do one thing. That's part of this.
That is a thing that the planning board has tried to do for more than a decade. Every time you run into a circumstance where, for whatever reason, an applicant might have to go before two different boards to do the same thing, and they might end up with boards disagreeing with, we call it applicant ping pong. We try to avoid that. Where the applicant has to try and broker a peace between boards. We don't want that to occur. There is a change, that change does have an effect under 9.22, this on the last page, that might be of concern to the ZBA, and you should probably have a conversation with them about this as this, if this goes forward, as this goes forward. Right now, under 9.22, if there's any enactment of that section, it is always the Zoning Board of Appeals. Whenever there's a substantial change to an existing non-conforming use, it's always the Zoning Board of Appeals. Under this provision, whoever is issuing the permit for the use also issues the special permit for the change in the nonconformity if there is one. And that is a substantial change, and one that there may be some concern about. So just so that you know that.
So, I guess maybe I didn't really understand it then. So under what circumstances would the planning board be granting a special permit for a use?
If the use itself nominally in the chart, use chart, is a site plan review
Oh, it's a site plan.
use in that zoning
I
district.
see.
But the building
Building makes it not conforming.
is nonconformity, and so it needs relief under this section, then this would allow the planning board to also issue that special permit, so that it's all one permit process, rather than go to these folks, then go to those folks.
So, okay, so in 9.22, the amended version, you have a use that is non-conforming, so a use that is not allowed in a zoning district, but they're changing it to a use that is allowed by site plan review. But because the building is also non-conforming, I'm getting a little confused here.
There, 9.22, and we may need to actually run this through staff again. There are a number of circumstances under which properties go through 9.22. It is a kind of steam valve. If you have an existing non-conforming use in a zoning district and you want to make a change to that use, to the building or the site or whatever, you usually have to go through this to assure that it's not substantially more detrimental to the neighborhood. We may need to break this out into circumstances where the use is allowed by right, or circumstances that the use is not, or something like that. But I want you to know that whatever change we make to this section is not going to be immediately comfortable. There will be some concern about it, so.
I'd just be a little further, I think Jonathan alluded to this earlier, that because of the change that we've had administratively in our office, one building commissioner to another, the new building commissioner is looking at things in this particular issue in a little stricter manner and not, just sort of saying, well, I'll deal with it this way. He wants to be absolutely sure that he's dealing with it in accordance with the letter of the bylaw. So that's why some things would end up going to two different boards, and we're just trying to make it clear in the bylaw that that would not need to happen.
So comments on this, Connie?
Well, I would support this as a priority because we've been lobbied heavily by staff who have to deal with the front line of people coming in, and I think we're creating some burdens on people that don't quite make sense, and some extra expense for people as well. I do have, I think we need to go back if we decide to work on this and pull a little bit of this apart, because the one that says, kind of sets this condition for load bearing doesn't totally make sense to me, because I can think of some additions or changes, alterations that aren't load bearing that may not be the sole criteria for that category. But there's little things as we get, if we do choose this to dive into. But I want to support it because I think the staff has made us aware of the need for this. I don't want to have to explain this one to town meeting. That sentence that you read here at 9.202. Good luck.
So just a question about the intent of the intent of the load-bearing question. If I move an interior load-bearing wall, does that trigger this?
No, it has to be exterior and
I would just say exterior
structural.
wall, because I'm not sure why a load-bearing would.
Change to exterior.
Yeah, I mean, I think everything up till load-bearing is fine, but I think a load-bearing confuses it, because I can't think of a case where that would be
Porch.
helpful.
Porch, yeah.
Not relevant.
Okay, so you have a porch.
You could have like a side porch if this on the side yard or something.
Partially enclosed porch, it could be.
But why isn't that covered by the previous one? Alteration or enlargement? Oh, I see. Wait a second, the load-bearing involves alteration, enlargement, or reconstruction of elements of the exterior building. Because it could be a non-load-bearing part that you're, like, let's say you have a steel and glass building, and you're bumping out the glass part, which is non-load-bearing, but not the steel part, which is load-bearing.
I don't want load-bearing to be the focus
Couldn't
of
get
this.
past it.
The point is to try and define the phrase in the previous sentence, shall not be structurally altered, because that's one of the problems that we've run into. Well, what does that mean? I mean, what is a structural alteration as opposed to an
Alteration to the structure.
cosmetic alteration, or
As a what?
as opposed to a cosmetic alteration or something?
Exactly what it is. So just what you said. Anything that basically triggers a building permit would be what? So cosmetic alteration wouldn't require a building permit.
So, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
It just needs, it'll need more work.
Yes.
So I agree with Connie that this should be a priority because there's, staff has indicated that this is really necessary. However, I also think that this might take longer, so this is not a one-off. It's, so keep that in mind when we think about how we're going to make our recommendation. If we want to do this, it's going to take some time, so.
There's one other structural issue. And this is a grammatically structural issue. So section 9, proposed section 9 point.
Structure of grammar?
Section, and this is inside baseball. So 9.201 refers back to 9.2000 through 9.2002, except those two sections are only for residences. So in a way, it's a kind of a non-tidy reference.
Oh, I see.
So in other words, I think that the intent is to have language for business, BVC, BL, similar to
Well,
the previous language.
Actually, in those sections themselves, there are no references to residential.
But there are, but the supersection 9.200 refers to single-family. So those are subsections of,
So could you just move,
We could repeat
9.201.
them. I was just trying to,
or the other thing is just take where it says single-family, two-family, and then add, make 9.200, combine that with the business stuff.
yes, that would be.
Yeah.
That way you only have to list them once.
okay.
Thank you. Right, it was structural.
Site plan review waiver?
We had the same property to which Chris was referring also raised another question. The proposal was to change the use from the use that occupied the building to more of the use that occupied the building. That is to say, instead of one of those uses or two of those uses, there would be many of those uses in the building. The way the parking requirements for that use work, it's based on square footage. Square footage was not changing, but you were going from a potential of 3 or 4 employees to a potential of 12 or more employees, and that changes the parking requirements, parking need. So there was no way, it was a site plan review use, it was a by right use. There was no way to identify that the requirement was increasing, because the requirement wasn't the way the parking regulations stated. It's a certain number of parking spaces per square foot, or units of square feet. So what this would do is to try to deal with circumstances where the use is not changing, but there's more of them, and the intensity of the use is changing without triggering other requirements under the bylaw. It allows the building commissioner to refuse to waive site plan review. Previously, the way the language read, the building commissioner was essentially obliged to waive site plan review if the conditions listed were met. And what this does is allow it to become more of a discretionary process, that if the building commissioner believes that there's a significant increase or intensification of the uses, of the impacts, and then those are listed, then they can refuse to waive site plan review and send it on to the planning board.
Okay. I think this one's similar to the other one. It's something that staff has indicated a need for. This one seems a little easier to me, but this might also take a little bit more time than I originally thought. I'm inclined to suggest we go forward with this one.
I agree.
Yep. Okay.
Okay. I'd like to go back for a second, because I didn't provide you with anything, but under residential use amendments, there was a D, responses to rental regulations, parking, and others. One of the things that will need to happen is that the two sets of requirements where they speak to the same thing will need to move in tandem. They'll need to be the same. There's some discussion of partially reflecting the zoning requirements for the number of parking spaces per dwelling unit. But with rental units, also, what that does is establish the minimum, 2 parking spaces per dwelling unit. There's some thought toward establishing a maximum, no more than 1.5 spaces per tenant recognized on the lease and so forth. So that is the kind of change that might be occurring in the rental regulations, which you might need to field or respond to in terms of changes to the zoning bylaw. I just wanted to make you aware of that possibility. And that partly came up because we're dealing with parking calculations next. Yes, Chris?
I just wanted to add something to what Jonathan said. Staff has become aware that the Zoning Board of Appeals and the Planning Board don't always travel down the same road with regard to parking requirements. I think the Planning Board has a strong feeling that it's not necessarily a good idea to provide all the parking that anyone might possibly ever need, and that, you know, less paving is better and people can use the bus and ride their bikes and walk, et cetera. So, but The Zoning Board of Appeals is also very aware of issues related to people parking on lawns, and if there isn't enough parking available to accommodate all the cars, then you end up with a big mess. So we have been thinking that it would be a good idea to have kind of a forum where the planning board members and the Zoning Board of Appeal members met and discussed your varying points of view about parking and tried to understand each other's points of view, so that you who set the zoning bylaw were more aware of their concerns and they understood where you were coming from with your regulations.
You respond to that?
I'd love to see one more part of that discussion, and that's on-street parking, which I guess would be the DPW. And so in particular, the parking ban from December 1st to April 1st, which I think in some ways exasperates the problem during certain times of year for reasons that aren't 100% clear to me. I mean, I'm clear why the problems exist, but I'm not clear why the regulation exists. So I would love to hear more about that and why we do it that way.
The principal purpose for the ban is the presumption that there's going to be snow and that you can't always predict when the snow is going to occur. And if you get a heavy snowstorm unexpectedly, you can't clear the road. It's about plowing. So the ban it's a sort of a blunt instrument to make sure that there's no cars there, whether it snows or not. But if it snows heavily, the cars aren't there and they can plow and keep it clear. Whereas if there are a bunch of cars there and they have to plow, they'll either plow the cars in or the road gets narrow, and that's, I'm not defending it, I'm describing it. That's the intent.
Just curious why we don't use the Northampton method, which is you get a warning, like a 2-hour warning or something like that, or Cambridge, or, you know.
Because snowplows rule.
Yeah.
So you're suggesting
That's really almost a separate question than the ZBA and the planning board.
Yeah.
That's a larger policy
Yeah. So
manager.
I think having a conversation with the ZBA on some of these interpretive things is really great, but I wouldn't want to just meet and talk about parking. I think we probably have an agenda of maybe 3 or 4 or 5 things that each board might want to agree to talk about. So it would be more fruitful if we did it as a joint conversation on issues, not just focus on, hey, you guys, what's this parking deal?
okay. So
How do you feel?
a separate meeting, or as part of a planning board meeting or a ZBA meeting, or what was it?
We've gotten that far
Not
yet.
gotten that far. Okay.
ZBA has periodic administrative meetings where they sit down and they just talk about how are we doing this kind of thing, and they don't have any hearings. We might have a joint one of those. And it's also all getting to be time, and we need to talk to town council, but we round about this time of year when ostensibly it used to be quieter, we would bring town council out and have them do a training on things like conflict of interest and so forth for planning board and ZBA members, and any new things that have come up. So maybe we can sort of combine those purposes. Okay, the next thing on the list, if I may, parking, it should be calculations. This says requirements. Really what the initial impetus for this was to say that when we're doing the parking calculations for different kinds of uses, we often end up with fractional results. And as we do elsewhere in the bylaw, or rather elsewhere in the bylaw, we have a mechanism for dealing with that. If it hits 0.5, it goes to the next whole number. If it doesn't, it stays at the lower number. We don't have that here. We'd like to add that so that there's not an interpretive dissonance when the boards are dealing with it. Also, there's a provision, and this goes back to the question of what Chris was talking about, the distinction between the way the ZBA approaches this and the way the planning board approaches it. The planning board approaches the parking, or has in the past and so far within my experience, as a sort of a more global question. Do we want more paving? Do we want to encourage people to use cars? And tends to shrink it down, whereas the ZBA has the bias of we want to make sure that even during peak periods there is enough parking there that people aren't overflowing onto the street and ancillary problems are not being created. Under all of the parking requirements for the different kinds of uses, at the very last one basically says for anything else that we haven't already provided a standard for, you should provide adequate parking spaces to accommodate under normal conditions the cars of occupants, employees, and so forth. What we'd like to do is move that up and add that to the first paragraph, but modify it so that it says, except as may be otherwise proposed or may be, there's a B missing there, required by the permit granting board or special permit granting authority, you go ahead and provide adequate spaces. In other words, we can alter this, we can modify this. 7.90, which is the last section of, it's not on here, of the parking article, allows the permit granting body, whoever it is, to waive or modify any of the parking requirements, whether it's for the number of spaces or the design or whatever it is. And that's always present here, but we'd like to better frame that. There's also one, and we included, I included all of the requirements here so everybody could see it. But also for the very last section, there's a reference to a specific section number for office uses. It hasn't been that section number for some years, so we're just lining that out.
Is there any circumstance in zoning where the fractional number actually is important? In other words, why shouldn't the rounding be global instead of in each section?
Oh, you mean distinctly unique? Good question.
I can think of one instance. This came up recently. I can't remember which case it was, but there was a question about when parking is calculated on a per floor basis. You end up with a certain number for the first floor and a certain number for the second floor, and if this number for the first floor is 5.5 and the number for the second floor is 4.5, do you add 5.5 and 4.5? Or do you round both of them up, or do you round one, some of them down and then add them? There's a lack of clarity, and the Zoning Board of Appeals has had difficulty with this. They really want everything to be extremely clear with regard to parking. They're less, the planning board kind of looks at this like, okay, applicant, tell us how much parking you need, and we'll see if we think that that's reasonable. And the planning board, in my experience, kind of uses the numbers in the parking section as a guideline, more than a rigid box that you have to fit in. The zoning board
Pirate code.
really, not being part of the zoning drafting and creation like you are, is more inclined to stick with the box that's provided for them and perhaps require more parking, but almost never require less parking. So they need, as I'm saying, a fair amount of clarity about what is expected of them. And, if there is leeway within this, they kind of need permission to use that leeway. I don't know if that's clear, but.
Which explains the second or third sentence, the last sentence in that paragraph about calculation. In order to calculate parking requirements under the section that deals with the fractional requirements, the figures for each individual floor or cumulative level of gross floor area shall be calculated and rounded separately and then added together to establish. That's here's the stepwise process you use to calculate this.
Right, so the second, just one more sentence. In that instance that I was talking about, I think that they were very concerned that if you rounded both numbers up and then added them together, you ended up with a number that was too high to be accommodated on whatever lot there was. And if you didn't round them and just added them together, then you ended up with exactly the right number. So it was very troubling to them to figure this out.
I have a question, but can't that be waived under the section that's not included
Yes.
here anyway?
Yes.
So
Yes.
I guess,
The zoning board is less inclined to take advantage of that
I
section.
hear that, but I
waiver.
don't find this as particularly compelling, and I'm afraid we're going to clutter up our agenda. Not that this doesn't, they all have merit, but it's like if we end up with a string of 20 things, I don't think we're going to do well at town meeting, and we're going to do well health-wise ourselves. But I see the problem, I understand the problem, but
I think that it may be that what would rather than doing this, what would address this question is having that meeting and having the discussion and pointing out, I guess, let me back up a step. The ZBA often deals with, much more often than the planning board does, deals with smaller scale changes in neighborhoods. And they're much more often in the crosshairs than the planning board, and there aren't as many of them, so they're a room full of people and there's only 3 of them sitting there trying to respond to it. There's 9 people up here, and you can sort of, you have a more substantial phalanx.
But are they saying, please help us, we need this fixed, or is the staff trying to guide them
I
in a
think
certain way?
I think my inclination, and it's personal and professional, and you judge for yourself what it's worth, is in the meeting to say, look, you're the special permit granting authority. That is automatically a discretionary permit. You need to be comfortable with the fact that the discretion has been given to you and you can use it. And in this case, in particular, there's a, get out of jail free card and get $200 while you're doing it thing at the end of the section that says you can modify this or waive this for good reasons no matter what. So just relax and go ahead and do that. But that's my own bias in the matter. This was an attempt to try and address that. Moving right along to the last one of these, or the second to the last.
How do my colleagues feel about this one?
I would agree with Connie. I think that we have enough on our plate right now.
Okay, anyone feel strongly about doing this one? I don't.
I think this is a really important one, but I'm not sure this is a really important one right now. But in particular, I think it looks very scientific, and I think that's probably one of the issues. When you bring things to, the decimal points, past the decimal points, it looks like there truly is science behind it, but there's not. It's really an art. So I would love to look holistically at even, all of the calculations, but I don't think I have the bandwidth to do that right now.
When we hand the boards a paintbrush, they're all this wide. I mean,
just the good number of appeals that, the owner has done a calculation that blah, 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 and we buy it. And I think that they're usually right, but it's all an art. So I think that, I really do hope that we can go back and I'm not even sure what the standards are to kind of recalibrate the whole thing.
They move. There is a Institute of Traffic Engineers does studies nationwide for peak times and develops, figures for specific kinds of uses. Any of our use category, there's about 4 or 5 of them, and you're clustering them all together and you're averaging them. But that's Oklahoma.
Exactly.
At a truck depot as well as, a little town in the Berkshires. So it's not, they're not immediately transferable.
But there's sort of ground truthing that somebody could do. That should look at.
Yeah.
Basically, we could look at aerial photos and see what percentage of parking lots are actually used. I mean, I think that'd be actually a really. Yeah, my spare time after I do the.
Yeah.
I won't be ground truthing any of it.
The last of the ones that we brought you here, and I want to talk about another one in a second, that we didn't bring, we sent you, but we didn't copies, is the permit findings and criteria. This was an outgrowth of the development modification attempt, and what this proposes to do is to alter the way in which we use findings and criteria, such that what are now the site plan review criteria, which are in greater detail, more numerous, and so forth, and in many cases repeated verbatim in the ZBA's findings, become the standard criteria for design and all of the things for both boards. And consequently, the findings that a special permit granting authority has to make are many fewer and have to do with the larger, broader, policy-based, more discretionary issues, so that a special permit granting authority has to make those findings. It also has to go through the criteria. but we have one set of criteria for both boards. We don't have two slightly variable criteria. We have the one consistent set of criteria. This is a semi-important thing for towns to have. I know our building commissioner is sort of excited about having it be this way rather than, because he often goes to the ZBA meetings, and part of the what the different stories that and cultures that get started around how do we deal with this particular criteria, whether it's parking or something else, is the fact that there are two different sets. If there was one set, it would be one set. And these issues, when differences arise in terms of interpretation and application, they'd have to be ironed out. So that's part of the intent of this. I don't know whether this is the answer, but this is, and this also, you can see this is from December of 2011.
Bruce?
I think this is important, but I think it could wait, because I think this is going to be very complicated and take a number of hearings. As it did the last time. That's why we didn't get any farther than that the last time.
Any other comments?
I agree, I'd like to pass on this, but I would suggest that the way you've drafted 10.386, that we do not put a section in like that, because I see that as a road to no development anywhere, anytime. I don't think we have a way to measure those impacts, and it's a whole new criteria that we haven't had before. And if you put schools in there, the same reason why Chapter 40B doesn't look at school impact, you will never see another family housing development in this town.
So
Not to be opinionated or anything.
I agree with Bruce. I guess that this is important. We started, as you mentioned, the ZSC started working on this a couple years ago. We're looking at it, and I don't think it's that it's as complicated as Bruce thinks it might be, because I think it's close. I also don't think that it's a super high priority. Maybe we should add this to the list of things that we discussed with the ZBA before proceeding.
Right.
So,
if I may then, did not include copies of the maps that we had sent out in email, partly because they were just illustrative. They weren't meant for real digestion. But what they were trying to illustrate in terms of the village centers is a principle that rather than going to a form-based district, which is what we had done before, which combined use regulations and form-based regulations and other things all into one new and alien and terrifying format, what we might want to consider doing instead is slightly altering and then using the existing zoning districts, village center business, village center residence, commercial, neighborhood business, so forth, and doing things to them, adding basic form-based regulations, period, throughout for all of those mixed-use districts. For the different villages, adding an overlay that is specific to that village center, and approaching this in an incremental fashion in that way, sort of shrinking the intent. I think that would actually get us fairly far, fairly fast, given the amount of groundwork that's been done on the village centers so far, in both Atkins Corners and in North Amherst. So I'm suggesting that you might want to start looking at that at your upcoming meetings, some examples of that, and seeing whether that seems to make sense as an approach.
so I completely agree with that. I think the ZSC has indicated that that's what it wants to do, but the planning board seemed lukewarm to it. So I think what we need to do is make a better case tonight that whether it actually results in articles for this spring's town meeting, I hope that it does, but whether or not it does, that we actually work on it now because it's a high priority and get the articles done as soon as possible, hopefully by the spring, and but not to put them off and start again next September when there might not be enough time to get them ready for the fall. So, I agree. I would like to reiterate to the planning board that this is our first priority.
I totally agree, and I'm thinking maybe a little ahead on process. I'd like us to set a working session aside, maybe even go back and drive around the village center areas, and then sit with maps where we can really see details on existing zoning districts and possibilities. Maybe even not our regular Wednesday night, but pick an extra meeting, or I hate saying this, Saturday morning or something. And we just do this in certainly an open public meeting, but it's our working session. People can listen, and then at the end we might have a short comment period, but that we just like really look at parcels and lines and see if we can get a new way into this.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I mean, the ZSC has already done that, but now there's a new ZSC, so you're right, it should be done again. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. Has anyone changed their mind about 400 Main Street or TDR about as far as whether we want to take that on ourselves or let someone else drive that?
I had a suggestion that is imposed by time on the suggested public hearing schedule or meeting hearing schedule. The first tentative date that we had set for having a public hearing was February 20th. In order to get a legal ad out for that, a hearing on that evening, we would need to publish it this coming Friday. So one thought, and this was Chris's recommendation, so she should take the credit for being alert to this, is that you've already seen the general scope of 400 Main Street. We would have time between now and then to have sort of prepare the issues for discussion, and that might be the first one up.
Okay.
That makes sense?
Okay, and what about the resolving the 1417 conflict too? Might as well
Sure.
get that out of the way. That shouldn't take, more than 5 minutes, really.
Yes.
Okay.
Are there any
Want to do both of those that night?
Are there any other easy ones on there that we looked at?
I think there are. I think the agricultural processing might be easy, but maybe not. I don't know. It's hard to say.
We could do 400 Main Street and the 1417 resolution, the 20th, and then on March 6th we could take up the next ones that are ready. I think agricultural processing would be ready by then, and maybe one or the others.
So we need to decide whether we're going to make any kind of different recommendation or what exactly we're going to recommend tonight to the planning board. I also guess want to give the public a chance to speak. Do you want to address anything before we wrap up?
Thank you. I had 3 brief points.
Okay.
I've been trying to develop a design with Mr. Kuhn for a commercial building, and I can understand the issues that Mr. Tucker and you were talking about. It's not economically viable, and I'm trying to make it so, but I have a 4,000 square foot footprint, and I'm allowed 3 stories and only 4 units of residential above. So I have 4 2,000 square foot apartments. And with the demographic I'm going for, I want an elevator so people can age in place, and it's just really complicated. And I wish I could do more units, so I hope that happens. And we're also having trouble because you have a limit on no more than 10% on the first floor in a commercial zone can be related to upstairs. And I need 2 stairs and an elevator, and that's more than 10%. And it's very hard to fit that in. And I think if you changed it to 30%, then you could even have part of 1 unit on the first floor and allow a reasonable number of stairs so people can actually get to their apartments. So that'd be cool. Secondly, Owen Drive is a good example of a conservation subdivision, but it was mandated by a court case. And I hope that maybe under your TDR standard, you will allow and encourage residential subdivisions to have a farm protection type goal. And I think if you allow cluster development and have special permits to not mandate incredible side setbacks or lot size or circles with diameters, I think you're going to have more farmland and forest land preserved in the future. And I think TDR might be a place to stick that before it's too late. Last I knew, ag processing was allowed anywhere by state law. And you guys know better than I do, but there's a famous forest case about that, and the sawmill was told it couldn't be in a residential area, and the sawmill is ag processing, and it was allowed anywhere. So I didn't know if your attorney wanted to look at that.
The ag exemption is based on acreage, among other things. And so in a center, an appropriate agricultural processing facility that was doing, for instance, canning or something like that, would not have that exemption available to it if it was on a small lot. So part of the intention of adding this use category is so that even the non-exempt, or particularly the non-exempt agricultural processing facilities would be possible, because it's not mentioned anywhere in the bylaw now.
Cool. Thanks.
Okay, Chris?
I just wanted to question whether we have language already for the resolution of Article 14 and 17. Okay.
Yep, yeah, we saw it.
So we need to have that in order to publish the legal ad.
Right, we got it.
We got email. So any comments about what we should say tonight? I guess my intent would be to reiterate our preference to concentrate on mixed-use center amendments, including the COM and dimensional amendments that we talked about tonight that are new, but also including working on village centers, both changing how form-based code or form-based design standards are integrated into the bylaw, and also the boundaries of existing BVC and RVC zones are drawn. And then we mentioned a few other things that we thought would be fairly easy one-night things, possibly ag processing, LID. I think those might have been the only two that other than the technical fix ones, the ones that the staff requested, non-conforming structures and SPR. So I guess what I would say is reiterate our preference to work on the process on the center amendments. Indicate that there are a couple other ones, maybe two, that we think would be quick, and then there are a couple other ones that might take more time but are desired. And so that's what we want to proceed through. So spend maybe 2 total sessions on the easy ones and the technical ones, and then the other 4 or whatever sessions on center amendments, and hopefully have something ready by spring, but not necessarily indicate that is what the plan is. Does that sound right? Did I miss anything? Go ahead.
Did we want to still consider private student housing sites, or is that further down the list?
Well, we don't have language to start with. We don't have language to propose. So obviously, yeah, we want to do that, but I don't. It didn't sound to me like there was something that
right.
we have something to work on. So.
But I think there's a lot of, I'm sorry, there's a lot of collateral, like the changing of commercial and.
Yeah.
We are addressing it around the edges.
Okay, so that's what I'll say then. Go ahead.
Just so I understand, the ones that I had, in addition to what you mentioned, I think, were the BL and commercial district dimensions, maximum height modification, the
Yep.
non-conforming buildings, and the site plan review waiver. In addition to the village center and,
Yeah, I guess I was suggesting that the BL and Com district dimensions, maximum building coverage, maximum height modification, those ones were all part of center amendments that might take longer than 15 minutes or might take longer than a day to work on, but that was part of what we were working on.
all right, I just wanted to make sure that I understood that, all right.
Okay, so unless there's any further business, we'll adjourn, and our next meeting will be next week, right?
Yes.
So